Welcome everybody to this panel organized by the Peace Research Institute Oslo. My name is Henrik Syse and I am a very proud colleague of my colleagues at PRIO. PRIO is an old institution that has followed the course of peace and the possibilities for peace in our world for many decades. And of course, many people ask, is there space for peace today? Is there space for peace talk? We had a dialogue about that just this morning. And we will continue that now from the vantage point of believe it or not space. So welcome to 45 minutes of travel into the great unknown. Is outer space developing today into an area of increasing conflict, or can humankind make space an arena for peaceful collaboration? Well, we will look back first in history to the groundbreaking events of the Apollo program. Some of you are old enough to remember that. I am barely. The 1960s and early 1970s, and we will not least talk about the unique Apollo-Soyuz Test Project exactly 50 years ago this summer, a forgotten event in the history of peace and conflict. Where is this heading now? What will China and the US be doing as they both increasingly see mastery of space as decisive for national security and future conflicts? And what role do satellites play? Just think of how dependent we are on satellites in our everyday lives. We all are across the world. What sort of role can they play in current geopolitics? Can humankind use and explore space together peacefully? Or will space become a battlefield in future wars? To discuss these fascinating and literally out-of-this-world issues, we at PRIO are proud to have with us Maja-Stina, Ekstedt, who is Executive Vice President at KSAT, Kongsberg Satellite Services, and who follows the development closely, not least when it comes to the question of satellites. From our own ranks, we have doctoral researcher, my good colleague Giacomo Bruni, a specialist on space geopolitics, and we have someone called Henrik Syse, who is myself, who has just written a book with his daughter, Jenny, who is also here. It's on the history of the space race, and it includes certainly relevance for peace research. So I'll start by giving the word to myself and to Jenny. It's not every day that I do things in the family. So even though PRIO feels like a family, this is extra special. So Jenny, please join us up here on space. No, rather on stage. Oh, I wish I know. I'll just start very briefly. Hopefully you can see the slides up here. If those in the back of the room want to come closer, there are actually there is space up here. We had to start with this one. One of the most remarkable of the astronauts back from the 1960s and 70s, Jim Lovell. Some of you will know him through the persona of Tom Hanks in the famous film Apollo 13. He passed away on Friday on the day of a full moon. Here's our book, or at least the cover of it. We have used a saying from one of John F. Kennedy's most famous speeches on space at Rice University in 1962, when he asked the question, why do we go to the moon and do the other things being such things as climbing Mount Everest, or Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. We do them not because they're easy, but because they're hard. So we've called it Fordi det er vanskelig in Norwegian. We were thinking if the English translation would be because it's hard, but that may be misunderstood, so we'll see. Maybe it'll be not because it's easy in English. And we are very proud to have had on board Fred Hayes, who was the colleague of Jim Lovell, the lunar module pilot on Apollo 13, who has written a preface.
Thank you. Yes, the picture we see up here signifies really what this book is about. What I call the 3 M's. We have the moon, the machine, and the man. Of course, I'd prefer woman too, but that's a different discussion. So it highlights the 3 aspects, the science, the technology, and of course the human aspect. All 3 things came together in a beautiful harmony to place humans on the moon several times between 1969 and 1972. And this particular astronaut, he's not just any astronaut. Of course, you're not normal if you go to the moon in the first place, but this man is called Jim Irwin. And after returning to the Earth, he became a religious minister because he needed a new language to express and to convey what he had seen from space. Not just seeing the moon up close, but seeing the Earth from afar. This is known as the overview effect, seeing the Earth from further out, which we'll get back to later.
Absolutely, but it is an essential part of what captured people around the world when it came to space. However, it started out with fear. It started out in 1957 when the Russians managed to put the first man-made satellite into space, Sputnik. You've heard the tapes. Beep, beep. This groundbreaking thing that they've actually managed to cover and conquer space. Can they put weapons on board? How will this be used? And how can we overcome them? How can we overtake them in this space? It's the origin of what we know as the space race, and the origin of Kennedy's big idea in 1961 to put a man on the moon. Now I'm using this picture to convey to you that in spite of this being a really fierce battle between the superpowers, in many ways the pinnacle of the Cold War, this is the way in which the Cold War functioned, that you had these huge competitions for being best. The scientists admired each other greatly. On the left here you see Yuri Gagarin, next to him you see US Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and then you see Ed White, and all over on the right Jim McDivitt from Gemini 4, from the American space program. They are meeting in Paris at an air show in 1965, but it's not atypical, because it conveys this enormous admiration the two sides had for each other and the underlying ambition that maybe we could do it together. It's actually one of John F. Kennedy's last speeches was in the General Assembly of the United Nations in September of 1963, where he says the United Nations should go to the moon together. And we should do it with, not least with the Soviet Union. 2 months later, he was dead. A few months later, Khrushchev was no longer the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. And the whole dream fell apart, but it was kept alive. And it was not least kept alive through what was created, and this is important, what we're going to talk about later, in 1967, the first UN Space Treaty of January 1967, where in the midst of conflict, they decided that we had to have some sort of ambition for working together in space.
Recently, I had a discussion with Stein Tønneson. We were invited on a radio show to talk about cooperation in space, where he pointed out something very important, that today we cannot achieve the space cooperation that we would ideally like, that we would ideally see. But they couldn't do that in 1967 either. Still, the different countries in the world signed, including the US and the Soviet Union, signed the space treaty. What does that tell us? They knew in 1967 that we could not cooperate like this right now, but maybe we can do it a few years down the line. And this is very important for us today, where we are in a similar situation as we were during the Cold War, where what our attitudes today and what we say today shape how we can cooperate a few years down the line. In 1967, they say we cannot cooperate now, but we will not close this door. We will not rule anything out. That's the attitude we need to have today. And this picture, coming back to the overview effect, is known as the birth of the environmental movement. I'm sure most of you have seen it. It was taken during Apollo-8, which was the first mission ever to travel to the moon, in December of 1968. It's known as Earthrise. In this single picture, you see everything. Every relationship you ever had, every conflict that's ever lived, every peace researcher that's ever existed. And Jim Lovell, who was on this flight, who we mentioned, who passed away a few days ago, he said that if you held up your thumb from the moon over the Earth, you would cover everything. Behind your thumb was everything. And this sort of symbolizes the fragileness and the smallness of the Earth. And in a galactic sense, insignificant. It's very small, very tiny. From the moon, which is not far out on a galactic point of view, you can cover everything. But still, it's where everything is. And also, it's, as far as we know, the only place in the universe where the universe can study itself. And so it is on a galactic scale, very small and insignificant. On a personal scale, very, very significant.
It's fun to listen to the transcripts when they're trying to take this picture and he has to change films. And I've explained that to young people and they go, change film? What is that? Because he has to get the color film into the camera. Well, we won't go on for too much longer, but we have to show you a few more things so we can lead it up to Apollo-Soyuz. Let's see if our sound works here. If not, I'll tell you what it is.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Actually, it wasn't really pre-planned that he was going to say that. Everyone says that some sort of bureau, some sort of agency had written it for him, but he came up with it on the way to the moon. But of course, this is this moment where a very interesting thing happens linguistically. We start, or philologically, we start talking about it as a we. Everyone around the world starts talking about we went to the moon. And that's what led up to this repeated insistence that we're doing something on behalf of humankind.
Good.
These are, let me see if I can move on from that one. There we are. I'll go back one. Well, I won't spend too much time on it, but these are the last words ever said on the moon by a human being. This is December 1972, Apollo 17, Gene Cernan. And there is a sentence here that may sound America-centric. That's America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. But that's because the command module was called America and the lunar module was called Challenger, so it's a pun on that. But he's expressing the idea that you mentioned. And that is one of the core ideas of Stein Tønneson, one of our leading peace researchers, is how you have to think about tomorrow today, even when it seems impossible, how you can carve out this space for working together. And of course, the famous ending, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. But we'll say a few words at the end about this one.
These two people, quite fascinating people. On the top, we have the American astronaut Tom Stafford, and on the bottom, we have, of course, top and bottom doesn't matter in space, but for the sake of this picture, we have the Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov. These were both top military men in their respective countries. They were both stationed on each side of the Iron Curtain in the late 50s. Literally, they were both in Berlin around the same time. Later in life, they became the best of friends because of what happened here in 1975.
And what arguably this is about, and this is our main point, is that it's a question about asking what sorts of arenas you can see for developing peaceful collaboration. And this is what happened in 1971 when Henrik Kissinger's national security advisor on behalf of the Nixon government went to the Soviet Union, or actually wrote NASA and asked them to go there to invite them in. Let's now see if we can create peaceful collaboration in space. And it worked. It's a true story. It worked remarkably well. And partly it's because space was seen as not that dangerous. You know, this is okay to work together. We won't give away too many military secrets. But there is more than that. There is this idea that we have to see how we can identify the spaces where we also can learn from each other, which I know you'll come back to in a second. I want you to remember that this summer is the 50th anniversary of this happening. Right now, as we are sitting here, it's 50 years since the signing of the Helsinki Accords for security and collaboration in Europe, arguably the beginning of the end of the Cold War. How could they do that then, during the Cold War? Well, there are many answers to that. We don't have time to go into the details, but I think one of the reasons is that this was still the post-World War II generation. These were people who knew how dangerous World War is. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, how incredibly dangerous nuclear war is. And they had a population in both countries that knew this. Where is that sort of consciousness today? Well, we'll land with this picture, and you can, of course, this is Deke Slayton, one of the leading American astronauts who finally went to space, one of the original 7 from Mercury who was stopped by a heart condition, finally could go, Alexei Leonov again. What were the things it led up to later, 15 years later?
Well, it took a few years before cooperation manifested itself in the way that we saw throughout the 90s. But what happened is that, in a way, the Soviet Union and later Russia returned the favor. Whereas the US had invited the Soviet Union in 1975, in the late 80s, the Soviet Union invited the US in. And this was because the International Space Station was, the plans for the International Space Station had started to form. It was decided that we were going to build a space station with plenty of different countries, and we need to learn how to cooperate. So the Soviet Union at the time had a space station in Earth orbit called Mir, and the Americans had their space shuttle, but did not have a space station of their own. And they realized that we need to learn not just to work together, but we need to learn how to develop technology together, how to speak the same language. We need to learn what needs to be known to build an international space station. And so the Soviet Union invited the Americans in, and before this, they had invited several other countries in to their space station to learn how to cooperate in space. And this led to the cooperation that we've seen through the International Space Station. Now, an interesting point is that one country that was not invited in and that has so far not been invited in is China, who have developed their own space conglomerate and their own space station, which many think was a grave mistake at the time.
I think it was. That's us. And I'm very happy to give the floor on to Giacomo. I'll just leave this up here in case anyone knows how to work their cell phone so they can use a QR code. I've learned now. And then you will actually get a signed copy of our book. But that's it. Thank you, Jenny. And Giacomo, please.
Okay, thanks, Henrik and Jenny, on a very informational discussion. As I've told you now by many times, I'm looking forward to the English version of the book, hopefully coming soon. Now it should be my task to bring the discussion back to the future, back to today. I'll be a bit less optimistic than you in the first part of my speech, where I'll try to reflect on what are the main challenges towards carving peace in space. And then after that, hopefully, we will have some time to debate a possible way forwards. The first of the challenges really connects to what you guys have been talking about. In between 1967 and 1979, from the Outer Space Treaty to the Moon Agreement, we've had 5 different treaties negotiated. Since then, there's been a few other declarations, but no treaty. The last formal binding agreement traces back to 1992, and that is the institution of the International Telecommunication Unions. Now, it's not the first time international law comes a bit late, but this is 33 years. It's a lot of time. And of course, part of the reason is the Cold War ended and space was deprioritized from international discussions. But what we are left with today is a governance framework which is thought and constructed for a space which is very different from what it looks today. And this leads me to the second of the challenges, which is of economic nature. Back in the times you guys were talking about, space exploration was in the hands of the state. Today, it's a very different picture. Today, the actors driving space exploration are commercial and private actors. And this is the moment where I should mention Elon Musk. And because of 2 main examples that connect to him, which really give you the idea of why this is an economic challenge. Now, what has happened is that we have been able to remarkably reduce the price for us to send objects into space from about 25,000 for 1 kilo to 1,500 for a kilo. And the price has been constantly reducing, and the trends point towards even cheaper missions. Now, the result of that was that we have launched many more satellites into space. Now we are at about 1200,000 satellites. The numbers are increasing. Now, the problem with that is that around 2/3 of the satellites are owned and operated by Starlink. And you can understand yourself that that is a big economic challenge when you have in the launching systems SpaceX, which is a near monopoly, and then on the satellite part of the equation you have Starlink, which is also a near monopoly. It becomes an economic challenge for other private actors to engage with, and it creates potentially dependencies which are crucial for a state to try to navigate. And that really connects to the third of the main challenges that I would like to briefly discuss, which is of security nature, because security today really is about economic security as well. And what we have seen is that space has been an integral part of military operation in contemporary context, especially so-called multi-domain military operations. We have seen that in Ukraine, for example, where Starlink has both been a facilitator and a constraining factor. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that because of Starlink, the Ukrainian armed forces were able to conduct operations that they wouldn't have been able to conduct otherwise. At the same time, in certain occasions, they were faced with the fact that Elon Musk himself decided not to provide them with satellite support. And that is, of course, extremely problematic. Now, related to that is the fact that there is not really a competitor to Starlink that is catching up very fastly. The second biggest satellite provider is a UK company, and they have about 1/10 of the satellites. Now, if you ask me which company is probably going to catch up faster, I would say, well, probably Chinese state-owned companies. Yeah. Why do I say that? Because we have seen that in other domains of operations. Chinese companies were way behind in electric vehicles, in drones. They were way behind in in solar panels. What they've been able to do throughout years is catching up, and now they dominate those markets. And that is, again, brings up a scenario which I don't even want to think about, in which, on the one side, European countries might be left with having to choose between Starlink, Elon Musk, on one side, and on the other side, a Chinese state-owned company owned by the Chinese Communist Party. This is a very concerning thought to have. And now, the last of the challenges which really connects to regulation, economic, and security, it's the politics of it. Because at the end of the day, it all goes back to the very question of, okay, what is peace in space? What would that even look like? And what I'm pretty sure about is that if you ask this question in Washington, D.C., Brussels, Beijing, Moscow, Oslo, you would have very different answers to that. And we have seen that political processes have been miserably failing. The last one of those was the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group I'm reading because I want to mention it correctly, on reducing space threats, which was launched in 2023. Yeah. They were tasked with coming up with a final report, which they were not able to come up with. So then they tried to come up with a procedural description of the meetings, which we're also not able to come up with. So they ended up landing on a summary of what the discussion was about. So this is the state where we are when it comes to political processes. Now, I promised that I would have some positive things to say, and I'm happy to keep that for the discussion, but I just want to say one that I think is key, which is this event. It's try to change the discourse around space. A lot of the discourse around space now revolves around the idea of a new space race. And I must confess, I'm guilty myself, because my project is called Navigating the New Space Race. So what I would suggest is to try to come up with something different. One idea could be to talk about space renaissance. Try to talk about ways to have a just, democratic, and peaceful space. I have more suggestions for later. This is it for now. Thank you.
This is what PRIO is all about, trying to find the path for peace, even when things do look bleak. Maja-Stina, Ekstedt, we're really proud to have you as our conversation partner at PRIO, as we are increasingly delving into these sorts of issues. So from the point of view of the work you do at KSAT, how would you look at the possibilities of collaboration? The floor is all yours.
Thank you. I hope we have allowed 2 hours or something, so we can talk about the possibilities. Looking forward to that.
Aren't you? Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I will speak a little bit about what we are doing and what we are doing in space from Norwegian side. And thank you for taking us back, looking at the history. I think I will also bring it from the stories from the earlier history, the earlier year, and what we are doing right now and what we are seeing now in the future. So first of all, KSAT is taking down satellite data from a lot of the satellites around the world. We have stations with antennas all around the world. The biggest station is on Svalbard. So just to give you an example, it's now around 180 antennas. Svalbard is the largest station in the whole world, which is taking down data from satellites all over the world. This means itself is collaborating across all countries. We are collaborating. I mean, we are working with NASA, with ESA, with JAXA in India, in Japan, in India, Germany. It's all over the place, at least where we have security agreements. And to work with space and space project, it is what your book is about. It's not easy. It's high costs. It's high risks. It's long term, and it demands a lot of knowledge to build these satellites, to build those rockets, to make them launch and to make them last. This means that each country cannot do this by themselves. They are sharing the information, they're working together, and they need these long-term stable contracts. So this is what we see. I mean, it's loads of examples on these kind of collaborations. We can just use Artemis program for NASA, which is the lunar program, which they are sending up a lot of things to the moon. And this is more or less not only a contract, it's a huge program, it's a framework, including countries all over the world to make this happen, to see how we can build in different components and competence and cost and risk together. Which means that it depends on trust and stability. There are loads of these kind of examples, and Norway is a big part of this as well, because we are downloading the data. We are doing it actually on this rover on March. It's Rimfax. We have sensors, which is created in Norway. So there is a lot of collaboration. Of course, we see the changes. We see that what is happening around in the world, the balance has changed. It makes it interesting, and there are some challenges, and there are some dark clouds. But at the other side, we also see that, okay, this means that we have to strengthen the collaboration with like-minded countries with the same values. All right, we are in a world to see that, okay, who are actually these countries and who are working together. But just some weeks ago, we were in Japan, and there were a conference, and they are so interested to work closer with Norway, for example. This is just one of many examples, because they are not sure if they see the same stability in the US as they have done for years and years and years. So these are changes, and we can talk about them more later on. I just want also to drop by the use of satellite information when it comes to peace. And one thing is all the collaboration and technology that we are dependent on. But now we have so many more satellites up and so many more advanced satellites that we get so much more advanced information from the satellites than we did before, and much more often satellite data as well. And when it comes to collaboration, when the really importance with the collaborative contracts or programs is where we can bring data together and information together and use that for different areas. And one of these really important areas to use the data in is actually peacekeeping activities. It is to document areas, what is happening. I mean, we need to know, to understand what is happening in areas to be able to act on it. And if we even can understand what is happening in areas before things are escalating, before it goes into a conflict, and go in with the information and work with that information. And this could be areas which is not very easy to gain information from, because they might not be able to use planes there, to drones or people itself. So to understand and put this information, which is from the satellites, into a context to see how can we use it and work with the satellite data to see how we can prevent escalating conflicts, and also for humanitarian aid and other actions. Really important. So I want to bring that into the discussion as well.
Thank you. What you are saying now lies at the core of so much of what PRIO has been doing for its history, namely gather information in order to make it easier to make the right decisions, not least get an overview, both in violent conflict when it comes to humanitarian disasters, and obviously they play a role. But let's talk about something really unpleasant, Elon Musk. The fact is, as you point out, Giacomo, he has a lot of power. I'm not saying he personally, although of course it is also personal with the sort of stake he has in his own company. Do you see what Maja-Stina is saying very interestingly here about the role of Norway? Norway's collaboration with what you call like-minded countries. I mean, Japan is an interesting example. India could be.
It is.
And I mean, they've signed the Artemis Accords. Do you see that as sort of possible counterweight to the sort of commercial interests that could be pushing in another direction?
Absolutely. I think Norway stands out as one of the countries which really has been active in trying to build alternatives to the likes of Elon Musk, etc., etc. The events that have been, for example, the launches we have, or the launch that we saw from the Andoya spaceport, it made the news as a failure, but I think it was a success. It was 30 seconds of flight where you have gathered a lot of information. For a country like Norway, not even 6 million people, to be able to project that power, it's an example of how you can cooperate between state entities and private actors, either technology, which is not even Norwegian, so it's an example of international cooperation. I think the direction is correct. What would be needed is more money, as always. Try to engage with even more private actors from like-minded countries. Try to engage with civil society. Spend money on education, because as Maja-Stina rightly pointed out, these things are expensive, complicated, and you need a lot of know-how. And that's how you start being less dependent on certain specific companies. But absolutely, I think Norway is on the right track. Now is the time to push forward. I would say.
And of course, a lot of people don't really know the sort of role that Norway is playing. So let me ask you, Maja-Stina, we are trying to develop a new project at PRIO on these things to complement the excellent work Giacomo is doing here. And we have, optimistically so far called it Satellites for Peace. We're going to discuss it a bit with the MFA actually on Friday to see if they're interested in following up on that tack. But if you go back in history, one of the first agreements that were made concerning space back in the early 1960s is collaboration on weather satellites. Quite basically, the fact that we can have common weather reports. That's a pretty important thing when it comes to, for instance, forecasting hurricanes. Do you see what has been pointed out here, and you yourself have pointed out when it comes to humanitarian purposes, that there is also a need-based push among everyone from China to the US, Europe, to do more, to use these satellites for peaceful collaborative purposes? Or are the political preconditions now just too negative?
I think it's definitely a need for it. It hasn't been a stronger need for it ever, in understanding situations, what is going on. And of course, it's for different kind of purposes. It could be for climate, obviously, and to understand the weather and the nature, and what are the consequences, of course. But at the same time, we see that all these conflicts, and war, it demands so much resources. It costs enormously of money, of lives, and the consequences for civil are so huge. So to understand how can we reduce the impact of conflicts or of emergency situations and crisis, it's a huge problem for countries, or national, but also internationally. So to understand that, you need more data. You need different kind of senses to be able to do something to reduce actually the cost and the risk of, even if it's in nature or if it's conflicts area. So we see that, and I think it's a growing understanding also, where they see that if we are actually bringing these data together, then we can act much further. And there are a lot of these initiatives, but still we see that now in the development of the world today, we see it's really important that these countries that actually could take a stronger responsibility for leading these kind of initiatives, it's needed.
Yeah.
And Norway is really in a position of taking a more peace-leading role for internationally.
Yeah.
Because, like this, you mentioned the alliance that we talked about. It's a new alliance between PRIO and the Norwegian Space Agency, KSAT and UNOSAT, which is in United Nations, the organization working with satellite data. Because each one of us, it doesn't help us if each one of us are trying to understand how we can use the data. We need to bring in and use the data together. And we think that the United Nations is one of the organizations that really needs to be lifted up and for using this. So I think to answer the question, I think a lot of countries see and really needs the information, but it's still a stronger need for coordination and creating the tools that can develop for international use.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please just raise your hand. But first, Giacomo.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because the way forward, right? That's always the question. I was thinking one way to do it could be to focus on what are the common challenges that are shared among the different big powers. And I'm referring, for example, to space debris, to monitoring systems. Because of what I said before, I think coming to a new space treaty in the coming years, in the short term, looking at 5-10 years, I see that as very unlikely. An alternative approach to that could be to try to develop mechanisms to cooperate on common challenges, space debris, again, monitoring systems, communication systems for operation that belong to the so-called gray zone, and that expand from that.
Yeah.
Have like a cascade approach. So you start from something specific and then you try to go to the general. Because I unfortunately think that a new space treaty in the current context is quite difficult.
And when they couldn't even agree on the meeting minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the space dangers. Please raise your hand if you have a question for this brilliant panel up here on anything. Also, if you have any questions for us on Apollo. For instance, who was actually on the backup crew of Apollo 14? You're all wondering, aren't you? He knows. Please. And speak out loudly. I'm not sure we have a microphone, so as loud as you can, please.
Thank you.
And I'll repeat the question. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah, here's a microphone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the presentations. It's interesting. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the debris question. I mean, how can you have peace in mind and peace in space if you shoot up so much debris? Could you do some philosophy on that? Thank you.
Well, I mean, we will need a philosopher here. We happen to have one. I'm a political
Philosophy
scientist.
of junk is actually a really interesting field. But how do we tackle that? You know, the fact that we are shooting up too much, both of you. Yeah.
So I guess the question is on the controversy between creating debris and try to
and how we
make
tackle
space.
that, you know,
I'm not sure I'm...
No, Maja-Stina, you want to say something? Because it is a real problem, isn't it?
It is a problem, and of course it's a high risk. I mean, with all these satellites that we talk about that are launched and going to be launched next year, the risks are huge for space debris. The positive side of that is that it's a huge challenge for everyone. I mean, even if you not have the like-minded countries, if they have, you know, an explosion of one of their satellites, it will remind similar damage for their own operations as it will for everyone else. So it is, in a way, even if it's a huge challenge and a risk around it and big questions on how to solve it, it is a huge question that has to be solved by everyone because the consequences of debris is huge. So when we talk about debris, it could be, you know, garbage from old satellite or junk, but it could also be, you know, you have small rocks and particles and everything else up there. But it's in everyone's interest to actually, you know, get the overview of it and get the solutions of how to avoid it. So at least that's a good thing that we have the same challenge.
Well, that of course is part of what we're trying to identify too, the places where we can agree. We have just 4 minutes left, so I thought I'd just spend 2 of those minutes on you before we have a little wrap up at the very end. Giacomo, working on what we could call the geopolitics of space. What about the danger that we all fear, weaponization of space? These things are, of course, regulated through treaties. But if you take your pessimistic hat on, do you see dangers and he has a pessimistic hat, as you heard.
If I take the most pessimistic out of me, I would say that space has always been militarized. The story of space exploration really is about the military domain. So in a way, what we're really trying to do is really carving out the space, the space for peace in space. Now, if we see an increasing trend towards the militarization of space, the answer would be, unfortunately, yes. What we see that is even more concerning is that space is becoming very much an integral part of any military operation conducted today. In fact, if you were to conduct a military operation today, probably you would start by conducting a cyber attack on the enemy's satellites, because you want to have your enemy blind. So there is an increasing amount of operations that fall in the so-called gray zone, and we don't have the instruments to tackle what is happening there. I leave it there since the time is running.
The dangers and possibilities of space. Jenny, tell us about April 1970, so we can end on maybe a slightly positive note, because in a way the world did come together then. What happened?
What happened in April 1970 is one of the biggest, emergencies we've seen in space ever, Apollo-13. This is where we started with Jim Lovell at the beginning. He was the commander of this flight. And what happened, the positive thing, is that this was really the first time where we in practice saw the Soviet Union and nations following the Space Treaty of 1967. One of the items in the Space Treaty of 1967 was that if an astronaut or cosmonaut lands somewhere in a hostile territory or needs help, every country has to help. If an astronaut lands in the Soviet Union has to send that person back, because astronauts are seen as representatives of all mankind. And in 1970, in April, the Soviet Union said that if your astronauts from Apollo-13 need help from us, from the Soviet Union, if you need recovery help, we will be there to help you.
So watch the film by Tom Hanks. Follow the work that KSAT and other actors are doing. PRIO will be part of it. Maybe we will be one day broadcasting from space, one of these panels. But we are proud to be part of this important slice of peace and conflict research. Thanks to Maja-Stina, thanks to Giacomo, thanks to you, Jenny, and thanks for coming. And if you want to have a look at our book, it's out soon, and it's about peace as well. It's a true story. Thank you very much.